Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome. Yes, everything is recorded. We just don't record the songs because we don't need to. Um, Hi, great to see you all. Um, Happy Wednesday. As I said to a couple of you at Minion this morning, ignore my voice. Everything's totally fine. Just imagine my normal voice. I'm good. I sound worse than I am. Just pretend everything's fine. Okay. Um, Okay, we are here. It's our last week together, which is disappointing. And hopefully we will have many more conversations as time goes on anyway. Just as a reminder, if you have missed any of the weeks, I have sent the source sheets via email. And then if you need any other ones, please let me know. And everything, all the classes should be on YouTube. So if you have questions or want to revisit them for some reason, they will be there for you. And as we spoke about sort of on and off the last few weeks, we are going to talk today about kind of what does this all mean in the modern context in terms of ethics, the environment, workers' rights, animal rights, all of that kind of stuff. And also just sort of some questions about what are some things that have come up that wouldn't have come up before. Sort of like we looked at gelatin, we looked at dishwashers. We're going to look at lab grown meat today. And so trying to understand sort of some of these more modern problems as it were, and what are we doing with those? But most of our time today is going to be spent in the world of how do we understand kashrut ethically, and how do we understand that in our current place. Hopefully we will have some time at the end today also just for general questions that have not yet been answered, whether it's about this or anything we've talked about the last 4 weeks, or maybe something that we haven't talked about but you still are wondering. So we will have some time hopefully at the end for questions. You can also always email me or put things in the chat along the way. I will put the source sheet in the chat and then share my screen as has become our custom. Let's see if this will cooperate with me. Okay. It is now in the chat, and we are going to start with some Torah verses that are not the kashrut verses that we looked at the first couple weeks, but other verses that people have used to try to understand other parts of kashrut and how it connects to our Jewish ethics and values. So we're going to start with this verse from Genesis. God settled the human in the Garden of Eden to till it and to tend it. This is the very beginning of Genesis. Before I tell you my take or how we understood it, anyone have a thought about how does that connect to kashrut, or how could that connect to ethics around kashrut?
There's no mention of animals, and I understand that until Noah and after the flood, humans could eat, let's say, animals' flesh. Before then, they were vegetarian. So tilling to me is the ground, things that grow.
Got it. Okay, so this could be a reference to some kind of vegetarianism or plant-based things. Okay, great. Other thoughts about it?
I feel like it's also saying that there's some holiness in the act of caring for the things around us, the natural things around us.
Great. How are we taking care of the land or of the plants or of the species that are there? Yeah. And I think that is the way I think it's mostly been understood, is sort of toward the idea of what's our obligation to the land, to this physical earth, to the space, to the environment, to all of those kinds of things. But I think it could also be connected to what kind of food they were eating or not eating. So that's our first verse. And we're going to look at these 3 verses, and then or these 4 verses rather, and then we're going to see them sort of play out in some of the ways that things are understood. So the second one, 6 days you shall do your work. This is very familiar to many of you, I'm sure. On the 7th day, you will cease from labor in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and that your homeborn slave and the stranger may be refreshed. Obviously, some of these categories have not aged well at all, but we understand it to just mean here are all of these categories of different people and animals in relationship with you. And they also should have that rest, that they also should have that seventh day. Someone just spell out clearly for us how this could be connected to this idea of ethical kashrut.
Slaughterhouses.
What'd you say?
Sorry, I'm reminded of the slaughterhouse debacle from
Yeah.
12, 15 years ago. These were run by Orthodox, air quotes, right, and disgusting conditions. And I know that then after that there was a whole discussion about this and another layer of kashrut in that it wasn't just the animals, it had to be the workers and the conditions were also at a higher level.
Great, great. So there's something here about how are the animals and the workers being treated in these environments, in the slaughterhouses or in other kinds of environments. How are these values being lived out? Because one of our values is a day of rest, and a day of rest should be for everyone and whether it's a literal 1 day of rest or not, the idea is we need to in some way be honoring the people who are working and these animals by not exploiting their labor or exploiting them in any kind of way. And so people come back to this verse a lot in understanding, making sure that we are treating people and animals the ways that we should in these different environments. Yeah, Marcy.
It also ascribes to animals some anthropomorphize the animals somewhat. From the perspective of it's not just a table that can work on all day long. It doesn't matter, the table doesn't have feelings. This is a living being that needs rest just as you need rest. So it brings the level up a little bit.
Great. There's more of a parity between animals and humans in this verse because animals are also included in the group of things or people or entities needing this kind of treatment and rest and respect. Great. Other thoughts about this verse? Okay, we are moving on. Our next verse is from Leviticus. So we're really getting 4 of the 5 books here. And Leviticus says, you should not defraud your fellow Israelite. You should not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer should not remain with you until the morning. Okay, someone help us with this one.
This is about paying on time.
Yeah, definitely it's about when are you paying people? And also I think it connects to some of what we just said in the last verse, which is how are you treating your workers? So some of that may be rest, some of that may be prompt payment, some of that may be whatever kinds of arrangements you figured out, but that treatment is really critical, and that is some of what the money is a piece of that. It's not just about rest, it's also about how are you compensating your workers and making sure that you are treating people correctly, fairly, honoring their work, paying them appropriately for that work. This also could be connected not just to keeping the money without giving it, but also fair wages, fair compensation, equitable compensation, those kinds of things. A lot of that understanding comes from this verse when people say, okay, well, how are these workers being treated in these slaughterhouses, as you were talking about, Sipra, or these different or companies or these different places, these different factories, what's happening with the workers?
It's also to me that those workers do not have to be Jewish.
Correct.
Okay.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. So this applies to any laborer and those wages. And I think it is an important reminder that this is, and that goes for all of these, that it's really about how are you treating people generally, not Jews, but people, regardless of who they are, especially if they are working toward creating kosher food or whatever else for you. Other questions or thoughts about this verse? Okay, off we go. So then we have this verse in Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, it says, you should not abuse, this sort of connects to what we were just saying, should not abuse a needy or destitute laborer, well, whether a fellow Israelite or a stranger in one of your communities of your land. Sipra really led us straight to that one. Sipra knew what was coming. So this sort of clarifies that we have to remember a lot of these verses were written assuming a world in which Israelites were generally very isolated and separate from other people. And so the reason for this categorization is that this is how the world was. We don't really live in that world. We're all just in a million different worlds with all different people who come from all different backgrounds, but they are not coming to it from that understanding. They're coming to it from the understanding of, we need to specify, is it this group or is it this group? And I think sometimes that can feel sort of confusing to us in a modern world, because we feel like, oh, but most of the people I know aren't Jewish. So I don't know. I don't think about this group versus this group. It's just people and they should be treated the same way. And so this is their way of saying, yes, this applies to everyone. And that whoever you are, that person should not be abused or should not be exploited, which continues our focus on workers' rights that we saw in the last verse also. Other thoughts about that one? Or questions? Okay, it's gonna be another quiet day today. Okay, so let's see some of what our sages have said about these verses over time. So this first one goes to this first verse in some ways about what are we doing with the land. This is about environmental impact. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shlomi, he's big. People know him as like the renewal rabbi, kind of, I guess is the way to describe him. In the 70s, he started the idea of eco-kashrut. And here's how he explains it. I invented the word eco-kosher to say that something is ecologically kosher. For example, the regular kosher way was about keeping dishes not contaminated. As we know, we saw that last week in very much depth about what things can't touch what things have to be separate. How do you do this? How do you do that? All of these kinds of things. And he is saying, okay, so for example, if he got a cup to get coffee, let's say you're at a non-kosher restaurant or something like that, or you're in some environment where you're not sure what else is happening in the kitchen, styrofoam would be the best choice. Or you could say a paper cup or something, but in the 70s, especially, just bear with me on the styrofoam example, okay? So styrofoam is the best example because it hasn't been used before or after he drinks from it. Then he'll throw it away and no one else will use it. So there's no risk of contamination because no matter what else is happening in that kitchen or in that environment, that cup is just a single-use cup and then it's done, no problem. You're with me so far? Okay. And then he says, that's usually the way to go if you're trying to think about kashrut in this way. But in comparison to that, what about the earth? What about the planet? If I choose styrofoam instead of a cup that could have been touched by something unkosher in some way, then the impact on the earth is much worse than if I don't. And so I make a different choice, and that choice is eco-kosher, which is sort of an idea of aligning your values, but one of those values is protecting the earth. And so how do those things sometimes come into conflict, which we sort of have been talking about over the last few weeks, and it's most of what we're going to see today. And this is, I think, a really good example of what happens when those things are in conflict and how do you resolve it. And so his resolution is, I don't take the styrofoam cup because to me, the impact of that is much worse. So I just drink a cup of coffee and I don't torture myself with the idea that that mug may have been contaminated in some way by something else. Thoughts about this perspective, eco-kashrut, questions? Anyone familiar with it? New? Any thoughts about it?
New to me. Love it, love it, love it. Because, you know, the number one directive is tend to the earth, right? Tend to the land.
Uh-huh.
And it's like right in the beginning. That's
Right.
number one thing. And so we know now that styrofoams and plastics and things like that cannot allow us to tend to the earth. They'll
Mhm.
allow us to keep the single-use kosher, but we can't do both. So you've got to choose one. And I believe tending to the earth comes tops. So I love that.
Great. Great. Other thoughts about it? I see in the chat that Jessica was saying that this is also something that she thought about last week when we were talking about if you have to kosher your dishes or you have to start over because your dishes aren't kosherable, then even though those aren't styrofoam and you're not throwing them away, you could be donating them or giving them to someone, that it's also still contributing to some kind of increased consumption, because then you're getting new things that technically are still usable. Like there's nothing wrong with your plates per se. It's just they can't be koshered. And so there is a waste question about that also. Obviously, donation of them is better than other options, but totally hear you that question of this competition of values is a tricky one. Anyone else?
Kind of feels like the spirit of the law versus the word of the law, you know, like it kind of has some interpretation that's involved in it, and it's more than just what's exactly literally written.
Yep. Yep. And that's really so much of this is, okay, here's really what was written, but also what was that intended to be? Because I think also someone had asked in one of the first classes, how do you make meaning of all of these rules and laws? Like, how can this be something that you feel like adds holiness or adds something sacred to your life, when it's just, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk and wait this amount of time, and you can't have these mammals, but you can have these mammals. And I think some of the question is, well, what was the intention in creating those rules? And some people say this was actually the intention, was ethical eating. We said in the first class that it's really really an intentional eating practice. And so what does that mean and what does that look like? And some of these considerations, some people argue, actually were sort of what they were trying to create with the ways that it was constructed, and some of those expectations and some of those things that were involved sort of in the world that they lived in were the ethical choices. And so not eating these certain kinds of animals or not boiling a kid in its mother's milk were actually ethical requirements or encouragements. But in our time, we don't see them that way, because we're like, why this animal and not that animal? And so then some people, I think, have taken that to mean, okay, they meant that to come from a space of how do we eat ethically? And so now in 2025, what does it mean to eat ethically? It may not feel as much like, oh yes, not if it doesn't chew its cud, it's out. It might feel more like, I'm not going to have a styrofoam cup because that's part of my intentional eating practice and trying to be ethical about my consumption in the world. So that's great. It's a great reminder for all of us. Other thoughts about this one?
It's interesting. I hear echoes in Reb Zalman's piece, similar to like the idea that saving a life is the most important mitzvah, right? So you can break Shabbat to save a life, i.e., there is something that's more important than this other thing. And so in this case, Reb Zalman is almost saying, well, the planet that we're on and tending to it and caring for it is almost, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, more important than making sure that this particular mug has not been touched by something that's not kosher.
Right. What in the competition of values, which ones win out? And when and how and what exceptions can you make? And I think that's a question that a lot of us sit with. And as you said, I think people are most familiar with it in terms of saving a life. And also it shows up in these kinds of moments and in these kinds of contexts in terms of, this is a huge value to me, but so is this. And those things aren't actually, they're sort of mutually exclusive. And so which am I choosing when? Okay, let's continue. We are going to look at just this short section from this interview with these two rabbis in 2008, but they were talking about the 70s. And they said, in 1971, you were the only Orthodox rabbis to declare that non-union lettuce and grapes should be seen as non-kosher, and you urged Jews to boycott them. What is the basis in Judaism for that position? And Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg says, we were both students of the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik. From him, we learned the idea that halacha is not just a list of ritual do's and don'ts, but a comprehensive worldview that applies to everything that happens around us. The Torah prohibits the exploitation of workers, so why shouldn't that apply to migrant farm workers picking lettuce or grapes? They were being mistreated, so it was natural for us to apply the principle of non-exploitation to their situation too. It seemed obvious. Let's think about that. 1971. That's pretty amazing. That's 55 years ago. And they're saying this makes it unkosher because of the ways that people are being treated, which is exactly what we saw in the verses in the Torah. What do you make of this?
Chavez, that's what I think of.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's-
sorry,
but-
Leah, what are you saying?
Chavez and the migrants fight at the time, but also it makes me think about the majority. I think technically the majority of American produce now comes from other countries
Mm-hmm.
because it's cheaper, the labor's cheaper, and then I think about the impact on the environment of moving that produce to various locations in the US.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And speaking of Cesar Chavez, you should go with Sipra and Scott on Monday. Sipra, will you tell people what you guys are doing on Monday?
Well, actually, Sunday night, we're taking our RV up to Delano
There you go.
because at 10:30 Monday morning, it's a Cesar Chavez celebration, and we're walking for 3 miles, and then there's a big to-do. But we did this before, and it's the farm workers, but also a lot of local unions, like the local carpenters, the teachers, the nurses. They all show up in support of the migrant workers, and over half of the folks in the fields are undocumented, just to be aware. So it's a very tenuous, sensitive time right now.
Yeah.
They will not
Not
be
sure if
there.
that's actually what you were going to say, but I just wanted you to give a plug for that adventure on Monday. A bunch of IKAR people are going up. Feel
Thank you.
free to join them. But did you want to add something else though, Sipra?
Oh, someone had asked, but because these are very sensitive times, if the farm workers show up, won't that be, yes, scary? They have been told not to show up
Yeah.
for obvious reasons.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Marcy.
You know what? When I read things like that, and I even into current times, yes, it's the farm workers, but Leah, you mentioned it a little bit. It's all conditions and all farms. So if we're going to take into account, Cesar Chavez and all the wonderful work he did, and in protecting the workers, it's ongoing. I live in Ventura County. I live in Oxnard is one of the biggest strawberry producers in the country. And we have a ton of migrant workers here, and conditions really haven't improved all that much. Because most of the stuff, the rich white people own most of the stuff, and they rely upon the hard work of the brown and black people, and they aren't paid well, and they don't receive insurance, and it's not as horrendous conditions, but it's still not great conditions. So I don't know, what do we eat then, right? If we use it as political action, I don't know what's clean unless it's RBZ's garden, and I have RBZ pick some lettuce for me in her garden, because I know everybody's been taking care of that.
Right. Yeah. It gets to be a very tricky question. At some point, it feels like we're making this ethical stance and this ethical stance and this ethical stance in a system in which there don't feel like there are a lot of ethical choices to make at a certain point. Then what are you left with? Especially if you aren't able to grow all your own food, then what do you do? And you'll be shocked to hear I don't have a great answer to that. Leah?
I was just gonna add that, there was an article in the LA Times a couple weeks ago about how, and I think it was specifically the strawberry workers, when the fires were happening, how employers are required by California state law to provide masks, and a majority of them either didn't do so or the workers weren't able to breathe while working, so.
Yeah, this is an ongoing conversation that is not just about Kashrut, right? It's a conversation we're very familiar with in terms of workers' rights in general. And I think specifically in this conversation today, how does that also impact the way we think about it Jewishly, not just in our city, state, country? Other thoughts about this before we continue?
It kind of makes me think about how you a little bit vote with how you spend your money. Like if you spend your money for a business that doesn't have good business practices, it kind of extends beyond food, which is interesting because you usually think about food with Kashrut.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's really it more expands the way that we're thinking about it. It's not just what food are you eating, it's how were the workers treated who made that food possible for you? Or how are the grocery store workers treated who are bringing that food to you, or whatever else it might be? Great. Okay, a lot to think about. We're going to look at one more sort of just a little bit of information about other ways that our commentators and sages have understood it, which are Jewish Torah and other Jewish literature lends support for ethical kashrut initiatives. Nachmanides, 13th century Spanish rabbi, argued that if people consume food that is technically kosher from a ritual perspective, but do not embrace the ethics that come along with consumption, then they become this category called naval b'rshut haTorah, sort of despicable or problematic with the permission of the Torah. They have broken no formal kashrut prohibitions, but their act is shameful, and they have not lived by the moral and ethical intentions of the Torah. And so that is, and as it says at the end, the simple sort of version is permissible consumption does not necessarily mean good consumption. And it sort of goes to what Elliot was saying about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So if you're saying, okay, but I'm not mixing milk and meat, I'm not eating these forbidden mammals, I'm not eating these forbidden birds, but you're doing it in a way that transgresses other Torah prohibitions, this is where we get stuck, because it feels like I talk to people all the time who say, I don't feel like I ethically can eat kosher meat because of the way that the kinds of factories that it's being processed in, the ways that the animals are being raised, all of that. But I'd rather just get it from my local farmer who I trust to raise their chickens on this pasture that I can see them and I know that they're being treated better and their workers are being compensated fairly, but then it doesn't have a hechsher and it's not kosher, but to me it feels like that's more aligned with my values. And so that's really where we get stuck, and where I think a lot of us get stuck, not just Jewishly, but in life, about how do we make these decisions. You know, there's that phrase people say, there are no ethical decisions in capitalism. I'm not promoting that or whatever, but I'm just saying, people say, like, at a certain point you feel like, what are the choices I have in front of me? If I make this choice, it feels good in this way, but bad in this way. If I make this choice, it feels good in this way, but bad in this way. If I choose this grocery store that's really close to my house, but I know that it doesn't treat its workers very well, but I can walk there as opposed to having to drive to the other one, is that better? Because I don't want to be driving everywhere, but the only one I can walk to is this one that I don't think treats people as well. Or I can get my organic food most easily at Whole Foods, but then am I supporting Amazon? And then I wasn't really trying to support Amazon. I was just trying to get my organic food because I thought that was better, and I wanted to get it from this organic farm that's in California that I think is more aligned with my values Jewishly. But then is my money going to Jeff Bezos and Amazon? Who knows? I mean, we know the answer to these questions, but where does that leave us then? Because
Get
that's
out of my head, Rabbi. Get out of my head. This is the craziness that I deal with. I'm talking about.
Right, but then where does that land us? Because as we've discussed, we need to eat something, right? And it needs to come from somewhere. And how do we make our best ethical choices about that, even when it's sort of impossible? Because you get into this sort of corner. And so eventually you just feel like I have to go somewhere. And I know that some part of that is not quite going to sit well with me. And what parts of my consumption can I most accept feeling not quite right? And what parts of my consumption do I really need to be exactly in line with my values? I don't have an answer for any of us. Yeah, Leah.
I just want to call out and honor the fact that I have choice and that there are many people who do not have are not able to make these choices.
Absolutely. Well, that's a whole other consideration. There are many, many people who do not have the privilege to be incapacitated by the choices, right? A lot of us are just surviving on whatever the food is that we can access, that's in front of us, that someone gives us, that we get somewhere else. And that's exactly right. And then I think there are a lot of people who are in a position to also be making certain kinds of choices, maybe not endless choices, but many people are making some kind of choices. And what kind of choices are we making? Because it's not just about having a ton of money to spend at any place that you want. It's just about the little choices day to day. Am I buying this or that? Am I not buying this or buying that? Or how am I going about eating the things that are presented to me? Even if you aren't buying them, how are you engaging with the things that are presented to you? Yeah, Jana.
There's another aspect that I want to bring from me that applies to me and want to bring up because it comes up when people discuss being vegan, vegetarian, meat eater, is the health consideration, okay? In the sense that I have certain gut issues, that foods that would be the mainstay of vegan or vegetarian diets for protein are not healthy for me. In terms of my digestive system.
Right.
So it's like intellectually, would it be not, would I prefer, let's say, to be vegetarian, but also for my physical body needs, other than the gut, I need meat and animal protein. And whenever I try not to eat that way, I suffer the consequence, I get sick.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure that I'm not the only person in this situation. So there's the health, ethical, moral health aspect as well.
Right, for sure. Yep, absolutely. That's another concern. And that's sort of another side of, I shouldn't say another side of the coin because there are only two sides of the coin and there are many sides of this thing that I'm talking about, but I can't think of a better expression. But another side of it is, what are the choices? It's not just about being in a position to be making choices about where you're spending your money, but also about what are the things that you need or don't need for your body, or there are health concerns the other direction. People who feel like, no, actually animal protein and consuming animal products for me is not healthy for me, right? Everyone has their own stuff. Okay, we're going to keep going. Marcy, I know you have something to say. We'll come back, but I want to just move forward a little bit. We're going to look now at two of the companies that developed in order to create kosher meat options that are also aligned with our other values, ethically, morally, Jewishly. And so for those of you who are animal consumers, the thing is, part of the reason that it's so hard is that it's so expensive. And this goes back to the access question from before, which is that kosher meat in and of itself, just the kosher meat that is factory farmed like everything else, is more expensive than meat you would buy that's not kosher. And so all the more so if you're then adding ethical labor practices, compensation, treating the animals well, giving them space, feeding them certain things and not other things, you end up in a situation in which these options do exist now, but they are not yet accessible options for most people, which is also very complicated. But we're going to look at them because it's important, I think, to see what is out there. And hopefully at some point, these kinds of things will become more accessible. First one is Whole Foods. They started in 2007, And we're just gonna go through some of the things that they say about themselves. Their mission is as follows: honest, healthy, sustainable, humane, and deliciously mouthwatering. We help balance modern and traditional values by producing glatt kosher meat that is environmentally and ethically sound. Okay, let's just start with that. What do you think of that mission? Thumbs up. Okay, great.
Sounds great, but very expensive.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're all on board with this mission. It's not as simple to be on board with it because most of us are not going to have the means to have this be the way that we eat meat in the world. Let's continue. Here's the history. We'll go through it. Started in 2007, trying to do this glatt kosher, organically raised, local grass-fed meat. And they were in partnership with the slaughterhouse, with the shul, with these kosher consumers who were really struggling to try to figure out how to eat kosher meat ethically. And this is what they came to. I'm going to move through this sort of quickly for us. And then they started focusing not just on doing less bad, but more good. So specifically focused on climate change. Climate change, as they say, is the biggest issue facing our lives, and every one of us needs to work on its mitigation. Whole Foods focuses on partnering with ranchers and farmers who use regenerative farming practices in order to rebuild soils and improve the environment. Of course, again, we all, I think, are very on board with these plans, but how it's hard because it's not really accessible to a lot of people, but the ideas, I think, are really aligned with what we've been talking about. And so they also talk about their ecological footprint and that they are really committed to thinking about that. And so it's not just about the regenerative farming, but also donating to different organizations to help these farmers so that they're actually also giving back to training people to be able to do these practices. And they also try to minimize their footprint. They have a lead green building. They deliver directly using compostable and recyclable containers. Some of the slaughterhouses convert their waste to biodiesel to fuel the trucks. They use a carbon neutral bank. I mean, they're really doing, I think, anything you could ask of someone who's trying to do this work. They've really thought about it. That every question, I'm sure someone has thought of other questions to throw at them, but I feel like overall, they have really found ways to address all of the concerns and questions that people would have. And also social responsibility, fair wages for the farmers and for the employees, variety of institutions that are helping with environmental sustainability and food security. And when they are conducting their business, making their choices, they try to be conscientious participants in the communities in which they exist. Okay, that is Whole Foods. That is the work that they are trying to do. What do you make of it? Is this new to anyone? This company, this organization, okay, great. Thoughts about it. What do you make of what they're doing in the world? A heart, yes. Okay, great. Other thoughts about it?
I think it's great, but as a vegetarian, I wouldn't know about them. They would
Exactly.
be on my radar.
They're still killing things, so yeah.
Great.
Yeah,
So
I wouldn't. It's not somebody I would give my money to, Sipra. I'm with you.
We have our vegan vegetarian contingent of the class who is like, cool, I'm still not impressed. Anyone else have a different take? Yeah, Danielle.
I don't know, but I mean, I would just say, it's nice to know they're out there. I hadn't heard of them before. I've never seen them before, so I don't know where like someone in Southern California would access their products. But
yeah, you have to order directly from them. It's not the kind of thing that you wouldn't find it at Ralph's, or whatever else. You would have to go to their website and then order, which is doable, but again, is another accessibility thing, which is, okay, it's not going to be accessible in those ways. You're not going to just see it out in the world. And so it's not, that part of it is also a little tricky.
And often, just to add to that, the waste issue, a lot of times when you have like food delivery, you have a lot of extra waste that comes with it, especially things that are perishable foods that need to be kept cold. So that's something I prefer to go to the store if I can.
Yeah, absolutely. They do say that they try to do all of that packaging that as compostable or recyclable so that it's at least better than, you're not getting a ton of plastic and stuff like that, but it is definitely a consideration. Yeah.
Yeah, if I had the means, I would do this, no question. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, every meal immediately. No, yeah, 100%. But
Yeah.
I feel like it's very expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to look at there's another one also called Grow and Behold that I've mentioned a couple times the last few weeks. And we're going to look a little bit at theirs too. We're going to move it through it pretty quickly because it's a very similar concept. And so we don't need to belabor the point too much, but they say, our promise to you, raised on pasture, no hormones, no growth promoting antibiotics. So that's sort of their tagline about it. And then they have all of these things that make it different. Pasture raised, which also is what we saw with Whole Foods. And they are very explicit about the ways that they are feeding things and things like that. If you are a vegan or vegetarian who is uncomfortable with these kinds of things, I don't know what to tell you, but this is where we are. Okay. I am also a vegetarian, so I'm with you. Okay. But then no hormones, growth promoting antibiotics, humanely raised and handled. And then they also have family farms. They work really closely with these family businesses run by people who really know and love their animals, and often are multi-generational farms and families, which I think also feels like a value that we can get behind. Non-GMO kinds of things. Yeah, the veal thing is very interesting. We're not going to spend much time on it, Jessica, but it is very strange. Wild caught, responsibly sourced fish, and then animals that are not penned. So these are sort of the same values you would expect from Whole Foods. Also, they express them a little bit differently. All of this information I just took from their websites, and I could have taken other stuff, but I wanted you to just see sort of the kinds of ways that they are presenting themselves and this option. And I think they both have grown a lot. Grow and Behold started in 2011. So they both started around the same time, and they really have grown a lot. And I think more and more now that people are really having these conversations about how do I live in these values that feel like they're in tension all the time, especially as the meat eaters. And so this is one route that people could go. And also, as discussed, it has other complications and it's not really accessible. And I know people who do it, some have done it a few times, but they don't feel like they have the means to consistently do it. I do know a couple people who exclusively get their meat from these places, but that really is not reality for most of us. And so we can't pretend that that's a possible option for most of us to just transition all of our meat consumption to coming from these places. But it is something that people are thinking about. There have also been a few attempts to sort of create a hechsher marking for kosher food for restaurants or meats that have been not just raised with sort of kashrut specifications, but also with ethical specifications. That was happening for a while. None of them have worked out. None of them have been sustainable. They've worked for a while and then not lasted, but I think there have been attempts to try to say, can we even mark them differently so that you know that this meat that you're consuming or this restaurant that you're going to has been sort of vouched for in all of these ways, not just in terms of the kosher slaughter, but in terms of the different practices of the workers, the animals, all of that. So there have been attempts, none that are currently so salient, I would say, but they're working on it. Thoughts about these before we look at lab grown meat for a few minutes, then I want to have some time for questions at the end. Okay,
I'm
everyone's
just curious, did they not, I mean, I knew that they had tried to do the separate certificate, so was there just not enough interest? And
That's my understanding. I don't know enough about it. There is, and there might be some I don't know about that are still in operation, but I know that, for example, the conservative movement sort of tried to do one for a while. And I think it just didn't quite catch on. I think that it's a hard sell for some people. I think that there are the accessibility questions of it. There are other questions about what's possible. I don't have a great answer about
wondered, yeah.
that. Yeah.
I talked to there's like a vegan Jewish deli called Morton Betty's that comes to the farmers market in Atwater, and so I've talked to the owner there, and she says it's actually really expensive to get some certifications.
Yeah.
So for definitely for smaller businesses, it's like a barrier of entry for certifications. And
Yeah, that's a great point too. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, some of this also is, again, an access issue for those small businesses too. And what are we spending our money on? And if you get that kind of certification or hexture, then that's helpful, but are you spending means you don't have to get there, and then that's not even worth it for you in the first place. So none of this is simple. I wish I were here to tell you I have an answer to all of our questions, but all I can tell you is I have a question for all of our questions, and that is all I can offer you. Okay, we're gonna look at lab-grown meat. I'm sad Susan's not here today because she really wanted to talk about lab-grown meat, but this is a question people have. Is lab-grown meat, first of all, kosher? Because where are the stem cells coming from that are creating this meat? Is it still considered meat? Also, is it better than meat because it doesn't have the carbon footprint? It doesn't have the same farming concerns. So we're gonna make our way through that quickly. Oh no, wrong things, what's happening? Okay, we're good. So here we go. So Rabbi Daniel Nevins wrote a tshuva on the kashrut of cultured meat, lab-grown meat. It's a 35-page tshuva. We're not going to go through all of that. So I'm just going to walk us quickly through some of the argument. So the question is it considered kosher? The people who say yes make arguments in the name of ethics, as I said, health, environment, ecology, energy efficiency. All of those sort of make sense in terms of ethics, animal rights, and there was no animal suffering involved in this process. There's the health concerns of the hormones that are being pumped into the animals. There's obviously the environmental concerns, the carbon footprint, all of that. Then there's also all of the water, the ecology, all of the water that is used to dedicate to livestock production that could instead be used for produce and things like that. And then also the energy efficiency, because the people who really are fighting for this lab-grown meat argue that in ideal conditions, it would take much less energy to produce that than it does to produce meat, but we don't know really yet if that's true or not. But those are sort of where we start from. And so they go into a halachic considerations about it, and they're halachic considerations because, well, he'll explain. Halacha addresses these concerns, the ones we've just looked at, these 5, under classical rubrics, some of which we've seen today. Minimizing animal suffering, Sa'ar Ba'alei Chayim, that's what we were talking about earlier with the Torah verses. Promoting human health, and protecting the environment, Bal Tashchit. So these are some of the things we looked at the beginning of the class today. While these have been greatly expanded, perhaps beyond the connection to the original context, we do acknowledge that the current declared goals of developing this cultured meat do seem to be sort of working along with traditional Jewish norms and values. So we're starting from a place of thinking, okay, a lot of these values, these 5 that we've talked about, are things that we really do care about. And so let's see if the lab-grown meat helps us in that thing. So then they say our halachic concerns are going to focus on production methods instead, because the values we're accepting are fine. Because some of the questions are the species of animal used as a source of cells to culture meat, is it a kosher animal? The prohibition of removing a limb or flesh from a living animal is a question. The kashrut of the ingredients that are used in the growth medium or as additives for flavor. The texture, shelf life, all of that has different additives. And the ritual valence of the final product, would it be meat or would it be parve? Because sort of like we saw with gelatin the first week, if you take this thing and you have the bones and the skin and all these things that are so removed from their original selves that it ends up being something totally different, is it even meat anymore, or are we now calling it parve? So this is sort of what we're laying out. This is where the argument starts. What do you make of this so far? You're with me so far? You're following it? It makes sense? It feels a lot like the gelatin argument in some ways, at least the ways they're thinking about some of it. Okay, So we are going to skip the 30 pages and go to what their conclusions are. You can definitely read the whole thing yourself and go through all of their halachic considerations that they go through, but I did not feel like a great use of our time together here. You can email me if you disagree. And then the end of this is they have 4 conclusions. 1, if cultured meat becomes a viable consumer product, it will be important to know that those cells came from a kosher species of animals and that any of the additives or other things are plant-based or synthetic and are also kosher. So it will need kosher supervision the whole way. That's the first conclusion, because otherwise there are too many opportunities for things to be added along the way that would not be kosher, or to start with cells from a pig or something like that. So you would need it. It isn't enough to say, oh, but it's so removed from those original pig cells that it's fine. It's not. So that's their first consideration, is fine, but it has to come from kosher animal, and all of these additives and other things need to be kosher along the way. Second is that cells, there's a question, as I said earlier, about does this count as taking a limb or flesh from a living animal, in which case it would be prohibited. But it doesn't count as that because the original cells are not being eaten and you couldn't actually eat them. So they're not really its own product, which actually is sort of like we were seeing with gelatin, but also even with the dishwasher stuff last week, because it's like when something is so removed from itself that it couldn't actually be eaten or consumed, it doesn't have to be subjected to the same expectations because it's not actually a product we would eat. And so it has to be 12 steps removed from that. So we don't need to worry that we're taking a limb from a living animal or anything like that, because none of that is actually technically what's happening. So far, so good? Okay. 2 more. 3. While cultured meat could be argued to be parve because it's so removed from actual meat, there is doubt about that. And so in that case, because it's also trying to mimic meat, it is better to consider it meat. And so, because it would be too confusing to have something that looks like meat, you say, this is the meat, and then you say, this is parve. And so you really, even though there's no need for kosher slaughter or soaking or salt, any of these kinds of steps that are part of kosher slaughter, that it needs to be considered as meat-y enough, even though it isn't technically meat, which is interesting because if you think about it, we sort of already have that question with not lab-grown meat with stem cells, but if you think about, you have like an Impossible cheeseburger and a real cheeseburger, and you say and sometimes they do look the same now. If you have like enough cheese and toppings on top of it, you wouldn't know the difference until you eat it. Then you could say, okay, should we be calling the Impossible meat? Because we're saying this is parve and this is meat. So we're already sort of in that conversation, though it wasn't from meat stem cells initially. And the last point is just, if it is true that in the end, this process is less cruel to animals, less destructive to the environment, more healthy for us, then actually not only will we accept it, but we will encourage it. That will be preferable to eating meat as it currently stands. And so we're still early in the whole development of this process. This is from just a few years ago. And so it's not a huge conversation that we're having yet, but this is where they land. What do you make of that? I know we didn't go into the details of their arguments, but what do you think about lab-grown meat as an option in these ways? Sipra and Marcy, would you eat lab-grown meat? Is that more convincing to you?
Scott buys those Beyond Burger things, which is fake. He's got one right in front of my face right now because it's no. It's
No, you're still no. Okay.
It's still too. Oh my God! It's
If,
still
if,
too
it, if its origin is meat, or if its origin is animal based, then no, it's I
Okay.
would not eat.
Yeah.
If
Anyone
it's
else?
fake, if it's pea based, or one of the other
right,
bases,
exactly.
it's fine.
Right. Any of the meat eaters, any thoughts about lab-grown meat?
Yeah,
There's
if they do it like ethical in the way that they're envisioning, 100%, like that's also a no-brainer to me.
Great.
Yeah, for me, it's the whole processing piece, where I try to eat whole foods
Uh-huh.
you know, and not
Right.
foods that are very processed. So to me, at least as I've understood the discussions that I've had a cursory interest in about lab created foods,
Yeah.
it's that processing piece that seems to be questionable.
Yeah. Yeah.
For me,
Totally.
I can't get over
Jessica?
the gag factor.
Uh-huh. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Jessica, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm basically a vegetarian, and I think I would be fine with lab grown meat if it hit everything in number 4. But also, to me, saying that the argument they're making in that 4th point is it's a little bit of a cop out. It's like, yeah, we're cool with it as long as it's like doing all this stuff, but like I I guess the leap for me is that it's probably not gonna be less cruel to animals, like it's not going to be able to check all those 4 boxes. But yeah, theoretically, that's great. Like that would be
Right.
awesome.
Right. Totally. Yeah, it's like we're sort of still living in the hypothetical world about it. I know I said I want to make sure to leave time at the end for questions, and we have 2 minutes, which isn't really time at the end, but I want to open it up either to more reflections on lab grown meat, but also if there are other thoughts, questions, things from the last few weeks that you're wondering, that you're thinking about, or things that you've learned that you want to share, or that you feel like you're glad you learned them. Anything that feels like you want to share in these last couple minutes. Yeah, Sipra and then Leah.
This isn't going back to like the second or the whatever. Chicken.
Mm-hmm.
I had read in some class ages ago that in the Middle Ages, because poor Jews could not afford meat, the rabbis, in a way, said, okay, chicken is meat. And it made them feel like they were as good as maybe the folks in the village that could afford meat. So it's raised up the level of a chicken to something that it was not before. That's what I had read.
Interesting.
Okay.
I am not familiar with that, but that doesn't mean it's not true. I think that makes sense to me in some ways, but I don't have a great answer. Leah?
I know we're out of time. I just want to say
You're good.
this class has been great because I've already actually changed my shopping habits.
Wow, amazing. How so? Are you willing to share?
I am willing to share right now in small ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I will have to have consideration about what it is. For example, veganese for me, which I love, and it also contains a lot of crap. So I'm making these, just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's healthy, but I am making slow changes, incorporating them.
That's great. I love it. That's really great. Any other thoughts? Anyone else have last things they want to say? Yeah, Jana.
This is coming from the perspective as a meat eater, but when I have looked sometimes, like at the veganese or some of the vegan products, that just like the low sugar products, the ones that are presumably healthy for you, contain synthetic ingredients that are not healthy for you. So that is another, you know, nothing for me is blanket good or bad. You have to look into, again, the production, the sourcing, the other ingredients. Yeah.
Right. It's back to the same question from before of where do we end up when we are sort of asking ourselves all of these ethical questions, and then we have to make some choices, and none of them are really as black and white as we think that they are. They just generally are not. I just want to thank you all so much for being here these last few weeks. It's been really a joy to learn with you all. We could do this class every week forever. There's so much Kashrut stuff to do, but I feel like we covered a lot of ground in these last 4 weeks together. And I really have learned a lot from your questions, from your thoughts, from your insights, and just grateful for this time with you all. So please take care of yourselves. As we get closer to Passover, if you have questions as you're thinking about it in terms of Kashrut, please don't hesitate to reach out. And if there are other lingering questions or conversations you want to continue that you didn't want to have here or we didn't have time for, I'm really thrilled to have those conversations with you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Really great to see you all. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.